Hey there, we are going right back into the purchase contract. So, yesterday we got down through the finance contingencies and the appraisal. So, today we're going to start in on the inspections. Let's take a look at line 182, paragraph 11, with the property inspection contingencies. So, the buyer and the seller agree, it states, that they enter into this purchase contract understanding that the property is being sold as is. And so you want to counsel your buyer. You've walked through the property, we've looked at it, we've seen the condition the property is in as far as what you're able to see with your eyes. You need to make your offer based on the current condition of the property. So, if you see some things that maybe aren't up to par, take that into consideration when you're helping your buyer write their offer. If there are some things that the buyer would want to have repaired, a little later we're going to get into the addenda that you can add into the purchase contract, and there's one called a repair addendum. So you could always present the offer requesting repairs. Now, I'll preface that by saying a lot of lenders, especially FHA, VA, rural development, the government type loans, they don't want that repair addendum attached to the purchase contract. So just be aware of that up front, that could pose a problem in financing. So if there's repairs required or the buyer isn't comfortable with the condition of the property, definitely have a serious conversation about the buyer continuing to pursue that property. So this due diligence paragraph states that the parties acknowledge that the real estate agents and agencies involved in the transaction have no special training or experience in regard to the structural, environmental aspects of the property, etc. I'm not going to read it line by line. Please do read the contract, study it, know it. But I will summarize. This paragraph basically states that you are a realtor, you're a real estate agent, and you are not an inspector, you are not a licensed contractor. You are not somebody who would know and understand or how to find hidden defects, or maybe even to notice infestations of termites or any other hazards that may be in place on the property. So it's basically a disclaimer for you and for Keller Williams Marquee. That we are not inspectors, we're not contractors, we're not electricians, etc. So referring back to the condition of the property, a buyer really can't come to you as their agent and say, well, why didn't you tell me the property was in such poor condition? Well, because I'm not an inspector. I'm not a contractor. Now, you can provide the opportunity for the buyer to bring their contractor or bring their inspector with you to a showing appointment. If you do that, or when you do that prior to writing an offer, then you would need to notify the listing agent that you are bringing a buyer, and that buyer is bringing a contractor or inspector with them to this appointment. So you'll need to get that approved prior to bringing in an inspector or contractor with your buyer. Okay. So moving on down, this is very important. Line 203 in bold. Bring your eyes down here. Buyers further agree that minor repairs and routine maintenance do not constitute a material defect. Painting, decorating, or other items of a cosmetic nature, regardless of the cost to remedy, shall not constitute a defect for the purpose of this property inspection contingency. So in other words, these minor repairs shall not be a reason to terminate a purchase contract. There was a time in our industry where some buyer's agents were saying, oh, you're protected by the inspections. If you're not satisfied with the inspection report, then you can legally terminate. That's not so much the case now, just on a blanket statement. Yes, the buyer is protected by inspections, but the minor repairs or routine maintenance items, those are no longer a legal reason to terminate a purchase contract. So please do not defer to the inspections as a possible way to terminate the contract. Yes, there are instances where the inspection results do constitute a buyer's termination of a purchase contract. And again, we'll get to that discussion in just a bit. But on the onset, you absolutely want to be sure that your buyer is 100% all in, ready to purchase this property in its current condition prior to inspections. Okay? All right. So there are obviously some situations. There's a discussion here about some minor and major components. The request for repairs shall cover only the major components of the real estate, limited to the HVAC systems, plumbing or well, electrical systems, roof, walls, windows, doors, ceilings, floors, stairways, appliances, and foundation. The major component shall be deemed to be in operating condition and therefore not defective within the meaning of this paragraph. It must not constitute a threat to health or safety and perform as it's intended, regardless of its age or regardless of it being at the end of its usual life. That language there, a furnace, so they don't build things today like they used to. I sold a house recently and the furnace in it looks like a dinosaur, right? It's still functioning. It's surely past its intended use, right? But it's functioning. It's working correctly. And we had a HVAC professional come out and look at it, and he said, this thing's never going to die. And it's still working. And so that was no reason for us to seek any kind of termination based on the age of that furnace, even if it was outside of its intended age of use, because it's still functioning properly. So that's what that language is. Just because an appliance may be at the end of its intended use, if it's functioning as it's intended, then there's no reason to terminate based on that appliance or the age of that appliance or disagreement on the replacement of that appliance. Minor repairs, routine maintenance items, and painting, decorating, or other items of cosmetic nature, no matter the cost to remedy, do not constitute defects and are not a part of the inspection contingency. Okay, buyer's initial here. Again, the address and the date will auto-populate at the top, and we come to the time frame. Within 20 days after the effective date or 10 days prior to the closing date, whichever is earlier, the buyer at the buyer's option and the buyer's expense may obtain written inspection reports from qualified engineers, licensed home inspectors, licensed contractors, environmental utility companies, the property, and improvements limited to latent defects, structural defects, water intrusion, environmental hazards, and damage, including but not limited to subsidence, undermining, settling, asbestos, lead and or lead paint, radon gas, dioxin, and storage of hazardous chemicals. And the list goes on. Please read every line, every word, get to know this language here and the terms and the inspection contingencies that are involved in the purchase contract. This paragraph obviously has to do with the time frame within 20 days of the effective date or 10 days prior to closing, whichever is earlier. So your closing date may be 40 days out. Doesn't matter, you need those inspections done within 20 days. Your closing may be 15 days out. That limits you to 10 days prior to closing, which means you have to have the inspections done 5 days into the purchase contract. So be aware of these inspection deadlines, these time frames. The other information to point out is the folks that are approved, I guess would be the word, to do and provide these written inspection reports. It's not your Uncle Joe who has hung drywall for 30 years. It's not your neighbor who knows about electricity. Whatever the situation, the inspector and the written reports have to be by qualified, licensed professionals, qualified engineers, licensed home inspectors, licensed contractors, like licensed roofer, or they are qualified in the environmental area, whether that be radon or lead or mold or whatever the situation. So again, they have to have some kind of credentials professionally in order to provide those written reports. It can't just be from somebody who is familiar with whatever the item is they're looking at. Okay, paragraph C deals with the environmental defects. Environmental defects would be the mold, radon, lead, dioxin, anything that would be harmful to human beings. And so the buyer has the opportunity to have those environmental inspections by a qualified environmental specialist in whichever field. The structural defect. If there is a structural defect in the foundation, footings, roof construction, sheathing, load-bearing walls that affects the structural integrity of any of the improvement, the buyer must have a licensed structural engineer report and provide the seller a copy of that report. Okay? Then there's additional language here in the event that report is provided, and then the mediation of that situation. You may have so a licensed home inspector is not a licensed structural engineer, right? So a licensed home inspector could say, hey, there's a problem here, but they're going to defer to the professional who is qualified in that area. So if it's a roof issue, the licensed home inspector may identify, hey, there's a couple of shingles up, you need those repaired. But the licensed home inspector is not a licensed roofer. So they may defer that the buyer get an assessment by a licensed roofer to ensure the integrity of that roof. Likewise, if there are cracks in the foundation, the licensed home inspector will defer that situation to a qualified structural engineer. So you just need to be sure that you inform your buyer of these situations that could come up, and that the correct or qualified inspector or engineer is the one who has to provide that report in order to move forward with either remedies or termination. So the structural defects have to be assessed by the licensed structural engineer, and that licensed structural engineer must provide a report in order to move forward in the terms of this paragraph. Okay, so we move down to paragraph E, inspection remedies. If the contract is not declared terminated pursuant to paragraph C, environmental defect, or paragraph D, structural defect, as described above, and the buyer has delivered buyer's inspection response within the time frame of B above to the seller, then buyer and seller shall have 10 days after seller's receipt of the inspection response in which to reach an agreement in writing for the repair of such defects by the closing date, including but not limited to who shall pay a specific portion of such repairs and the individual contractors who will do the work, or an agreed monetary adjustment at closing in lieu of the correction of the defects, or C, terms which include who shall pay and what contractors will do a portion of the work, together with an agreed monetary adjustment at closing. So the buyer has their inspections, right? There's 20 days to have those inspections performed. Typically what I do when I know we have an agreed purchase contract, as the buyer's agent, I collect the earnest money, get that deposited. I submit the purchase contract to the lender, and I have that discussion with the buyer as to what inspections they want to have. They could have sewer or septic. They can have the property inspection, the termite inspection, a radon inspection. They can have a survey. If there's a well, they can have a well inspection. The list seems kind of endless. Typically, most buyers have a termite inspection because that is often required by the lender. And then a buyer also typically has the property inspection. If there's a septic system, you absolutely want to encourage your buyer to have a septic inspection. More and more frequently, we're seeing sewer inspections because the ages of a lot of the sewer systems in our community are up to where we're seeing some defects in the sewers, the lines from the home out to the street. So you want to probably encourage your buyer, depending on the age of the home, to have a sewer inspection. So I have that discussion with the buyer on day one. You deposit the earnest money, you send the purchase contract and all attachments, disclosures, addenda to the lender. Of course, you get that signed copy to the buyer for their records, and then you have that conversation about inspections and get those inspections ordered and scheduled. The buyer can schedule them, you can offer that as a service, up to you, but get those inspections scheduled, okay? So that way you know that those inspections are performed within the limit of that 20 days. If you're on the phone on day one or day two, those inspections are scheduled, say a week out, you're well within your contract deadlines. Okay, so inspections have been performed, you get the report. Most inspectors will email you a copy of the report and your buyer a copy of the report. Now you have a little bit of time to review that report with your client and then request repairs. So that's what this inspection remedy paragraph is talking about. So you have the copy of the inspection reports. You and your buyer have reviewed them. Your buyer has 10 days after the receipt of the inspection report to negotiate repairs. It says 10 days after seller's receipt of the inspection response in which to get those remedies in writing. Okay, so you want to communicate with your buyer, figure out what repairs they're going to be asking for. A lot of times I prepare my buyer saying that this inspection report, the property inspection report, is basically like a honey-do list for you for the next 1 to 5 years. It's going to tell you the things that you really need to attend to pretty immediately within the first year of owning the property. And then it's also going to let you know some maintenance items and some repair items that maybe you can defer and address a couple of years down the road, or just keep in mind that this is going to need to be looked at and attended to in the years to come. I let them know that, we're only going to ask for repairs that involve safety hazards, structural defects, and environmental hazards. We are not going to look for, as we already had gone through the paragraphs, we're not going to ask for routine maintenance items or minor repairs, right? So you've reviewed the inspection report with your client, and your buyer will decide what repairs they want to have performed by the seller. So you help the buyer prepare the inspection response, and that's what this paragraph here is talking about. We have 10 days to come into agreement to negotiate out those repairs, okay? All right. We'll get into the detail of the inspection responses when we cover those documents on another day. We're going to move on forward through the purchase contract for now. The liability disclaimer here at the top of page 6 talks about the fact that the real estate agent shall not be liable for any damages incurred pertaining to which inspector or inspectors are chosen to conduct the inspection. It's a disclaimer for you and for Keller Williams Marquee that the buyer and the seller cannot hold us liable for any findings, okay? All right, moving on to paragraph 12, we're on line 290, the wood infestation report. No later than 10 days prior to closing, the buyer, at buyer's option and expense, or if it's a VA loan, it's at the seller's expense, may obtain a wood infestation and or termite report from a licensed inspection service. The termite inspector will provide a report, a written report. The termite inspection report does have a spot for buyer and seller to sign. If there are termite activity, tunnels, sometimes they see the dead tunnels and no insects, but there's no proof of treatment. The buyer then can ask for the seller to treat the house. But look, these deadlines are pretty strict here, okay? the inspection response, the buyer must get the inspection response to the seller within 2 days after the buyer has received the insect report, requesting the seller to remediate the concern of the insects. So very tight deadlines here. So you have a little leeway. 10 days prior to closing, this inspection has to be performed, but then there's only 2 days to request the seller to treat if needed. So you want to be sure you're aware of those deadlines. Usually when you schedule the property inspection, you just coordinate the termite inspection. It's all done the same day. You have the reports same day or next day. Just know that you don't have the 10 days or whatever to negotiate out the termites. You have to do that immediately. So be sure you're getting that termite inspection report and response to the listing agent ASAP. Don't wait on that one. Don't think, oh, I'm waiting on the radon test to come in and then I'm going to submit all of my inspection responses at once. No, you have to do the termite immediately. Okay, let's move down to paragraph 315. Oh, I'm sorry. One more thing about the termite. If there is termite activity or no evidence of termite treatment and the licensed inspector recommends treatment, and that's on that written report, if the lender is requiring that report and you have to submit it to the lender, it goes to the underwriter, the lender will require the seller be the one to treat the house. So just know that so that you have that in your mind in the event that that report comes back needing treatment for the house. That does have to be a seller paid remedy when there is a government loan, for sure. And I would argue even with a conventional loan, just because that expense would be a seller expense to remedy. Okay, moving down to paragraph 13, governmental inspections and occupancy permit. So most municipalities in our area do require the seller to order the occupancy inspection, or the seller's agent, who could be the list agent, order that occupancy inspection. There are a few municipalities in our general area that require the buyer to do that, but they're few and far between. What I would recommend is if you're not familiar with the area, you're representing the buyer, you know obviously the address of the property you're writing the offer on, go ahead and be proactive. Contact the municipality, the building and zoning, and ask them if that's a seller requirement in that municipality or if it's a buyer requirement. And that way you know, just kind of keep a mental note or keep a file where you have that information, so that then you know for that municipality what the requirement is. Also on different municipality websites, many times there is a list of requirements for that occupancy permit to be issued. Educate yourself on those. Go ahead and provide that to your buyer. But there's always the disclaimer that even though the municipality provides a list of requirements, there's no guarantee that all of those requirements are going to be met through that occupancy inspection. That's why we do recommend that the buyers have their licensed home inspector, licensed property inspection performed to protect the buyer, because a municipality occupancy inspection doesn't always achieve or see everything that's on the list that you may expect them to. So this occupancy inspection, occupancy permit, again, usually in most of the municipalities in our area, it is a seller requirement. So the contract reads, if seller is required to order an occupancy inspection and comply with all governmental requirements of the seller agrees to request same at seller's expense within 5 days of the effective date. If the buyer is required, then the buyer shall apply for the occupancy permit within a reasonable time. The seller has requested an occupancy inspection and shall obtain the occupancy permit per governmental requirements. So again, we've got some more deadlines with the occupancy inspection. As a buyer's agent, again, typically that falls on the list agent and the seller, but you want to be sure that you know the requirements for the municipality that your buyer or your client is purchasing in. If the property does not meet such occupancy regulations or pass for the inspection, the seller notifies the buyer in writing within 7 days after the date of receipt of the occupancy inspection report from the applicable government authority that the seller has not agreed to make the corrections. So there may be some repairs that the seller has to perform. If the seller is agreeing to perform those repairs and provide occupancy, then there's nothing else to do here, right? But the seller may say, I'm not doing all these repairs. The buyer's going to have to buy it as is. I'm not doing this. Then the seller, the listing agent, has to notify the buyer's agent that the seller's not going to perform these repairs and provide occupancy. That provides then 10 days of the buyer and seller negotiating, reaching an agreement, or terminating the purchase contract based on that information. Again, we'll get to that termination process in another day, a couple days down the road. The buyer's initials would go here at the bottom, and we move on to page 7. So at the top of page 7, again, the address and the date. If you're using DocuSign, those will populate. And this is the continuation of that discussion of the occupancy permit. If there are repairs required, the seller is refusing to perform those repairs and not provide occupancy to the buyer, then there are the 10 days that the buyer and seller have to negotiate those terms. Buyer can either move forward, or they can choose to terminate, or buyer and seller can reach some other agreement in regard to those repairs. So again, here in bold, as we discussed a few minutes ago on line 344, buyer is cautioned not to rely on the occupancy regulations, but should also satisfy him or herself otherwise as to the condition of the property by having a whole house inspection by a licensed inspector. The access to the property, the seller must provide access to the property for the buyer to perform inspections, for the lender to do the appraisal, for the governmental inspections to be performed, and then, of course, for the buyer to do a final walkthrough. So the access to property protects the buyer and their ability to access the property for those reasons. A buyer may want to go back through the property, which is fine if the seller is agreeable, but you don't want to be setting showing appointments and follow-up appointments like every other day and harassing the seller and the listing agent. Be reasonable. Combine as many of those inspections into one appointment as you can. If the buyer needs to come back through for furniture measurements or some other reason, get that scheduled with enough advance notice. And then, of course, schedule your final walkthrough. All right, we are going to stop there. We are at line 351. We're going to stop there for today, and we'll pick it up tomorrow and move into the title discussion.